The crisp autumn breeze swept through the bustling streets of Manhattan as Elizabeth Davenport adjusted the silk scarf around her neck. She was a woman of elegance, grace, and old-money sophistication, the kind who carried herself with the effortless poise of someone accustomed to privilege. Her morning routine often included a stop at Pierre's Café, a quaint yet refined spot near Madison Avenue, where she sipped her espresso while observing the world go by. But recently, her attention had been drawn to something far more exhilarating than her usual morning rituals: a gleaming, fiery red Ferrari parked across the street. Every day, without fail, the car sat there, its aggressive curves and roaring presence starkly contrasting with the muted luxury of its surroundings. Elizabeth had never been one to openly admire modern sports cars. She found them ostentatious, even vulgar, but something about this particular Ferrari intrigued her. Perhaps it was the audacious color, the bold defiance of its presence among the sea of black limousines and silver Bentleys. Or maybe, just maybe, it reminded her of a part of herself she had long since buried, a craving for something daring, something untamed. For weeks, she had found herself drawn to it, making it a habit to extend her coffee breaks just a little longer, hoping to catch a glimpse of the owner. The mystery of it all fascinated her. Who was the man behind the wheel? Surely, he must be someone of significance. A businessman, perhaps? A billionaire playboy? Someone with an untamed spirit that matched the beast he commanded? The thought made her heart race with a thrill she hadn't felt in years. Yet, every day, the car remained there, untouched, like a trophy on display. No chauffeur ever emerged, no valet ever retrieved it. It sat there, teasing her curiosity, an enigma waiting to be solved. And while she pondered its origins, there was one other element of her mornings that had become just as predictable: him. The young man with the audacity to approach her, day after day, despite her cold dismissals. He was always there, waiting just outside Pierre's, flashing that confident, almost boyish smile as he attempted, unsuccessfully, to win her favor. A black man, likely in his late 20s, dressed with a casual confidence that suggested he didn't care for the rigid formalities of her world. His name, he had told her, was Malcolm. And every morning, without fail, he would approach her with the same flirtatious energy. "Good morning, beautiful," he would say, his voice rich with warmth and amusement. "I was wondering if today's the day you finally let me take you out for dinner?" And every morning she would scoff, offering only a dismissive shake of her head before turning away. The mere idea of entertaining his advances was laughable. He was young, far too confident for his own good, and entirely beneath her standards. She belonged to a world of aristocrats and legacy wealth. He, she assumed, was just another dreamer, a man with empty charm and no substance. "You're persistent," she remarked one morning, sipping her espresso with a smirk. "I'll give you that." "You love it," Malcolm shot back, unfazed by her cold exterior. "You just don't want to admit it yet." She chuckled, not out of amusement but incredulity. The audacity of this man. To think she, Elizabeth Davenport, would ever entertain such a proposition. "I assure you, Malcolm, I do not." He only grinned. "We'll see." And with that he would walk away, leaving her to roll her eyes before returning her attention to the Ferrari. How amusing, she thought, that a man so audacious could be so oblivious to his own limitations. He was nothing more than a fleeting distraction, something to momentarily amuse her before she returned to her world of refinement. One afternoon, however, Elizabeth found herself lingering longer than usual. The Ferrari, still untouched, gleamed under the golden sunlight, and for the first time, she considered doing something reckless. Perhaps she could lean against it, feel its power beneath her fingertips, if only for a moment. It was a childish thought, but one she couldn't shake. As she took a hesitant step toward the car, she was interrupted by a familiar voice. "You really love that thing, don't you?" She turned to find Malcolm standing beside her, his expression one of amusement. He was always watching, always waiting for the perfect opportunity to tease her. "Shouldn't you be pestering someone else?" she quipped. He laughed. "Why would I, when I'm having so much fun with you?" Elizabeth sighed, shaking her head. "You really don't give up, do you?" "Not when I know what I want." He nodded toward the car. "Kind of like you and that Ferrari." She scoffed, folding her arms. Admiration and desire are not the same thing. Malcolm's gaze lingered on her, a knowing smirk playing on his lips. "Depends on who you're asking." She turned away, unwilling to entertain the conversation further. Yet, as she did, a sudden realization struck her. How did he know about her fascination with the Ferrari? It wasn't something she had openly expressed, at least not beyond stolen glances and lingering stares. Had he been watching her that closely? A flicker of unease settled in her stomach, but she quickly dismissed it. He was just an observant nuisance, nothing more. Over the following days, however, Malcolm's presence began to feel less like a coincidence and more like an intentional design. He was always there, watching, waiting. And no matter how many times she dismissed him, he never seemed deterred. Then one evening, just as she was about to leave Pierre's, she saw something that stopped her in her tracks. Malcolm, standing across the street, casually unlocking the Ferrari with a press of a button. The car's headlights flickered in response, and with effortless ease, he slid into the driver's seat. Elizabeth felt her heart slam against her ribs. The Ferrari was his? She stood frozen, her breath caught in her throat as the engine roared to life. Malcolm glanced in her direction, his smirk widening as if he had known all along that this moment would come. With a wink, he revved the engine and pulled away from the curb, leaving her standing there in stunned silence. For the first time in weeks, Elizabeth found herself at a loss for words. Elizabeth stood frozen on the sidewalk, watching the red Ferrari disappear into the traffic. Her mind whirled with disbelief. Malcolm, of all people, owned the car she had admired for weeks? It was unthinkable. She had assumed he was just another persistent admirer, a man without substance, clinging to her presence like a moth to a flame. But now, reality twisted her perception. He wasn't some lowly dreamer. He was a man of means, a man with a car that made her heart race. The irony of it all stung, and for the first time, she felt something unfamiliar, uncertainty. The next morning, she arrived at Pierre's cafe, her routine unchanged, though her thoughts were anything but. Malcolm was absent, and for the first time, she noticed his absence like an itch she couldn't scratch. Where was he? Had he grown bored of her dismissals? Was he deliberately avoiding her now that she knew the truth? The idea unsettled her more than she cared to admit. She sipped her espresso, but the taste was off. Or maybe it was just her mood. Something had shifted, and she wasn't sure she liked it. 2 days passed. Then 3. Then an entire week without Malcolm's usual interruptions. It was strange how she had once wished for his absence, yet now, the silence left a void she didn't expect. She found herself glancing across the street, expecting to see that familiar red Ferrari. But it never came. It was as if he had vanished, taking with him the unspoken game they had been playing. Frustration crept in, a foreign sensation she wasn't accustomed to. Had she truly dismissed him one too many times? By the second week, she couldn't take it anymore. She asked Pierre, the cafe owner, if he had seen Malcolm. The older Frenchman chuckled knowingly, wiping down the counter as he regarded her with amused eyes. "Ah, Madame Davenport, you finally miss him, he teased. Elizabeth scoffed, rolling her eyes, but she didn't deny it. Pierre leaned in, lowering his voice. He was here last night. Left in his car. Said he had business out of town. That revelation unsettled her more than it should have. Business? What kind of business did Malcolm have? That night, Elizabeth found herself deep in a rabbit hole she never thought she'd enter. She sat in her penthouse apartment, scrolling through her phone, searching for any sign of Malcolm. She didn't even know his last name. All she had was his charm, his confidence, and the way he had effortlessly held his own against her rejections. She clenched her jaw, irritated by her own curiosity. This wasn't like her. She didn't chase men, men chased her. Yet here she was, restless and intrigued by a man she had deemed unworthy. Another week passed before she saw him again. It was a Saturday evening, and Elizabeth was at a high-profile charity gala, draped in a sapphire gown that accentuated her regal presence. The event was filled with New York's elite, CEOs, politicians, and old-money aristocrats like herself. The air buzzed with polite laughter and the clinking of champagne glasses. Yet nothing captured her attention until she spotted him, Malcolm, standing near the bar, dressed in a tailored black suit that looked as though it had been made for him. He was speaking with two men who looked just as powerful as they were dangerous. Elizabeth's breath hitched. He didn't see her, not yet, but the sight of him, so composed, so at ease in a room full of the wealthy elite, made her question everything she had assumed about him. He wasn't out of place. In fact, he belonged. The realization sent a shiver down her spine. Who exactly was Malcolm? She had dismissed him as a mere admirer, but now she wasn't so sure. And worse, she couldn't ignore the slow, growing thrill that accompanied her curiosity. She moved closer, pretending to be engaged in conversation with an acquaintance while keeping him in her line of sight. The men he spoke with seemed to respect him, listening intently as he spoke. Then, as if sensing her presence, Malcolm turned. Their eyes met. For the first time, Elizabeth felt the power shift. His gaze was unreadable, cool, composed, but entirely in control. Gone was the playful man who had flirted with her outside Pierre's cafe. This Malcolm was different. More dangerous. More mysterious. And undeniably more attractive. He excused himself from his conversation and made his way toward her. Elizabeth's pulse quickened, but she masked it with practiced indifference. "Miss me?" he asked smoothly, taking a sip from his glass. His tone was teasing, but there was something behind it, something that suggested he knew exactly how much she had been thinking about him. She tilted her chin slightly, refusing to give him the satisfaction. "Don't flatter yourself," she said, though the words felt weak even to her own ears. Malcolm chuckled, his gaze never leaving hers. "I don't have to," he replied. "You've been looking for me." She inhaled sharply, his words hitting too close to the truth. He knew. He always knew. "You seem to think very highly of yourself," she shot back, sipping her champagne. "I simply found it unusual that you vanished." He leaned in slightly, his presence intoxicating. Unusual? Or disappointing? She stiffened, but the heat creeping up her neck betrayed her. Malcolm smirked, catching the reaction. "I knew you'd come around eventually." She hated how confident he was. Hated how, despite her best efforts, she couldn't shake the effect he had on her. "And what makes you so sure of that?" she challenged. Malcolm set his glass down and studied her for a moment before answering. "Because, Elizabeth," he said, voice low, "you like the thrill. You like the chase. And for the first time in your life, you're not the one being chased." Her breath caught. He was right. And that terrified her more than anything. Before she could respond, one of the men Malcolm had been speaking with earlier approached, whispering something in his ear. Malcolm's expression darkened ever so slightly. He nodded before turning back to her. "I have to take care of something," he said, his tone suddenly serious. "But don't worry. We'll finish this conversation soon." And just like that, he walked away, disappearing into the crowd, leaving Elizabeth standing there with more questions than answers. She exhaled sharply, frustrated beyond measure. Who was he really? And why did she care so much? This was dangerous territory, and she knew it. But the problem was, she had always loved danger. Elizabeth stood in the middle of the grand ballroom, the glimmer of the chandeliers reflecting off her sapphire gown. But all she could focus on was Malcolm's retreating figure. He disappeared into the crowd with the same confidence that had both irritated and intrigued her. She exhaled slowly, trying to regain her composure. Why did he leave so abruptly? And why did it bother her? This wasn't supposed to happen. She had spent her life being the one people longed for, not the other way around. Yet here she was, her mind clouded by a man she barely understood. She decided to investigate. Her instincts, sharpened from years of maneuvering through high society, told her Malcolm wasn't just an ordinary wealthy man. The way those men had spoken to him, the way he commanded their attention, it was different. He was different. She excused herself from a group of acquaintances and subtly followed in the direction he had gone. Her heels clicked softly against the marble floors as she weaved through the glamorous guests, eyes scanning for any sign of him. The air was thick with the scent of expensive perfume and aged whiskey, but her mind was only on one thing. She caught a glimpse of him through an open side door leading to a dimly lit hallway. He stood with two men, their postures tense, their conversation hushed. Elizabeth lingered by the doorway, keeping her distance but close enough to observe. Malcolm's expression was unreadable, but there was an authority in his stance, a silent dominance that unsettled her. Who exactly was he? Before she could move closer, one of the men handed Malcolm a sleek black envelope. He took it, nodding once before tucking it inside his jacket. Then, as if sensing her presence, he turned. Elizabeth stiffened, caught in the act. Malcolm's eyes locked onto hers, unreadable yet knowing. He excused himself from the men and walked toward her, his movements slow, deliberate. "Spying on me now?" His voice was smooth, but there was an edge to it. Elizabeth lifted her chin, refusing to appear flustered. I was simply curious. He stepped closer, closing the space between them. Curiosity can be dangerous. His words were a warning, but his tone was almost amused. He was enjoying this, her curiosity, her attempts to figure him out. And the worst part? So was she. She folded her arms. You're hiding something. Malcolm smirked. Everyone is. His answer was evasive, yet it only fueled her interest. Who were those men? She pressed. He studied her for a moment before answering. Business associates. The vague response only made her more suspicious. What kind of business? Malcolm chuckled, shaking his head. Now if I told you that, where would the fun be? He leaned in slightly, lowering his voice. You like the mystery, don't you? Elizabeth felt her pulse quicken. He wasn't wrong. But she refused to let him have the upper hand. Not yet. You're arrogant, she said, tilting her head. Malcolm grinned. Confident, he corrected. And correct. She scoffed, though she couldn't ignore the heat creeping up her neck. She hated how he got under her skin. I should go, she said, attempting to regain control. But Malcolm didn't move, his gaze locking her in place. Walk away if you want, he said, voice low, challenging. But we both know you'll keep coming back. Her breath caught, her pride warring with her intrigue. She wanted to refute him, to tell him he was wrong. But she couldn't. Because he wasn't. She turned sharply, leaving him behind as she re-entered the ballroom. But the air felt different now. The conversations, the laughter, the clinking glasses, it all felt dull. She knew it wasn't the room that had changed. It was her. Malcolm had shifted something inside her, and she wasn't sure how to undo it. As the evening progressed, she tried to distract herself, engaging in small talk with wealthy bachelors, but none of them held her attention. None of them carried that effortless confidence, that quiet power. None of them made her feel the way Malcolm did. As the night drew to a close, she stepped outside to call for her driver. The cool night air brushed against her skin, offering a moment of clarity. But just as she was about to get into her car, a familiar sound made her pause, the deep, unmistakable purr of an engine. She turned just in time to see the red Ferrari pull up beside her. The window rolled down, revealing Malcolm behind the wheel, a smirk playing on his lips. Need a ride? His voice was smooth, teasing. Elizabeth's fingers tightened around her purse. She knew this was dangerous. She hesitated for a brief moment before stepping closer. What makes you think I'd get in? Malcolm's smirk widened. Because you want to know more. And because I'm the most interesting thing that's happened to you in a long time. Elizabeth exhaled sharply, annoyed that he was right, again. She had spent years surrounded by men who were predictable, easy to read. But Malcolm? He was an enigma. And she was tired of pretending she wasn't intrigued. Slowly, she opened the passenger door and slid inside. The leather seats were smooth, cool against her skin. The scent of his cologne lingered in the air. Malcolm glanced at her, amusement flickering in his eyes. I knew you'd say yes. Elizabeth rolled her eyes. I didn't say yes. I just didn't say no. He chuckled as he shifted gears, pulling away from the curb. The city lights blurred past them as he drove, the low hum of the Ferrari's engine filling the silence. Where are we going? She finally asked. Malcolm kept his eyes on the road. Somewhere interesting. Elizabeth sighed, shaking her head. Vague as always. He grinned. And yet you're still here. She hated how effortlessly he read her. The car weaved through the streets, taking her further away from the glitz of the city's elite and into an area she didn't recognize. The streets were quieter, the atmosphere heavier. Malcolm, she said, a hint of caution in her voice. Where exactly are we? He didn't answer right away. Instead, he pulled into a gated parking lot, the entrance guarded by men in dark suits. Elizabeth's pulse quickened. This was not some casual joyride. Trust me, Malcolm said softly. She should have been afraid. She should have demanded he take her back. But instead she whispered, I do. He parked, then turned to her, studying her with an intensity that sent a shiver down her spine. Are you ready to see what's behind the curtain, Elizabeth? His voice was different now, more serious, more dangerous. She swallowed, suddenly aware that whatever came next could change everything. But she had already made her choice. She had gotten into the car. And now, there was no turning back. "Show me," she said, her voice steady despite the adrenaline surging through her veins. Malcolm smirked one last time before stepping out, motioning for her to follow. As she exited the car, the heavy metal doors in front of them slowly began to open, revealing the unknown world beyond. Elizabeth inhaled deeply, stepping forward. Whatever was waiting for her on the other side, she knew one thing for certain: her life would never be the same again. Elizabeth stepped through the massive metal doors, her heels clicking against the polished concrete floor. The space inside was dimly lit, sleek and modern, with an air of exclusivity. It wasn't a nightclub, nor was it a typical business office. It felt different. Powerful men and women were scattered around, engaged in hushed conversations, dressed in tailored suits and designer gowns. There was an unspoken tension in the air, one that hinted at deals, power, and secrets. She glanced at Malcolm, who walked beside her with quiet confidence. "What is this place?" she asked, her voice low. Malcolm didn't answer immediately. Instead, he led her past a group of sharply dressed individuals, all of whom acknowledged him with subtle nods of respect. Elizabeth noted the way people looked at him, not just as an equal, but as someone they answered to. He wasn't merely a guest here. He belonged. "This is where the real players operate," Malcolm finally said. "Where power isn't just inherited but earned." His voice carried an edge, and for the first time, Elizabeth realized how little she truly knew about him. "And what exactly do you do, Malcolm?" she pressed. He smirked slightly, as if he had been expecting the question. "I broker opportunities," he said. "I connect people who need things with people who can provide them." His answer was deliberately vague, but Elizabeth knew enough about the world to recognize when someone was involved in high-stakes business. "Legal or illegal?" she asked, arching a brow. Malcolm chuckled, leaning slightly closer. "Depends on who you ask." His words sent a shiver down her spine, but it wasn't fear she felt, it was intrigue. Dangerous men had always fascinated her. But Malcolm wasn't just dangerous. He was untouchable. They reached a private lounge, tucked behind a velvet curtain. Inside, the ambience was different, quieter, more controlled. A few men were seated around a marble table, discussing numbers and names Elizabeth didn't recognize. Malcolm gestured for her to sit, and she did, crossing her legs with practiced poise. One of the men, a sharp-jawed figure with piercing green eyes, looked her over before speaking. "Didn't expect you to bring company, Malcolm." His tone was measured, but there was a hint of curiosity. Malcolm leaned back in his chair. "Elizabeth's different," he said simply, as if that was all the explanation needed. The man studied her for a moment before smirking. "Different? Or just another thrill?" Elizabeth tensed, but Malcolm's expression remained unreadable. "She's not just another thrill," he said, his voice steady. "She's here because she belongs here." Elizabeth swallowed, her pulse quickening. Did she? She had spent her life among the wealthy elite, but this world, Malcolm's world, felt different. It wasn't just about money. It was about power, influence, and control. And for the first time, she wasn't sure if she was the one holding it. "What exactly is this meeting about?" she asked, keeping her voice calm. The green-eyed man chuckled. "Straight to the point. I like that." He turned his attention back to Malcolm. "The shipment is arriving in 72 hours. If your people want in, they need to move now." Elizabeth's stomach tightened. Shipment? People? The words hung in the air, heavy with unspoken meaning. Malcolm nodded, as if this was routine. "I'll handle it." The conversation shifted, but Elizabeth was still processing what she had just heard. This wasn't just business. It was something deeper, something on the edge of legality, if not already far past it. And yet, she wasn't running. She should have been afraid. She should have excused herself and walked out the way she came. But instead, she leaned forward, her eyes locked onto Malcolm's. "And what exactly are you handling?" she asked, testing him. Malcolm held her gaze, his expression unreadable. "Business," he said simply. "The kind that doesn't concern you." Elizabeth bristled at his dismissal. "Then why bring me here?" Malcolm smirked. Because I wanted to see if you could handle it. His answer sent another shiver through her. This was a test. And for reasons she couldn't yet explain, she didn't want to fail it. One of the other men, a quiet but imposing figure, watched her carefully. Most women would have left by now, he observed. Elizabeth met his gaze without flinching. Most women bore me. A slow grin spread across the man's face before he turned back to Malcolm. She's got fire. Maybe she really does belong here. Malcolm's expression didn't change, but there was a flicker of something in his eyes, something unreadable, something dangerous. We'll see, he murmured. Elizabeth knew then that she had stepped into something far bigger than she had imagined. And despite the risks, she wanted more. The meeting continued, and Elizabeth listened closely, piecing together fragments of a world she had only ever heard whispers about. Power, money, control. This was the real game being played behind the polished facades of high society. By the time the meeting ended, she knew one thing for certain: Malcolm wasn't just another wealthy man. He was a king in his own right, ruling from the shadows. As they stepped back into the main hall, Elizabeth turned to him. What now? Malcolm glanced at her, amused. Now? Now you decide if you want to keep playing the game. She exhaled, the weight of the decision pressing against her. She had two choices: walk away and return to the safe, predictable world she had always known, or step further into Malcolm's world, a world filled with power, secrets, and danger. But deep down, she already knew her answer. She wasn't the type to walk away. Not from something this thrilling. I'm in, she said, her voice steady. Malcolm studied her for a long moment before nodding. Then buckle up, Elizabeth. Because things are about to get interesting. And with that, they stepped further into the unknown together. Elizabeth's heart pounded as she followed Malcolm through the underground corridors of the exclusive hideaway. Every step she took felt like a deeper descent into a world she had never imagined. She had always lived among the rich, but this was different. The wealth here wasn't just old money, it was power earned in ways that were never discussed in polite society. The tension in the air was thick, unspoken deals being made in shadows. Yet, Elizabeth wasn't afraid. If anything, she felt more alive than she ever had before. This was the kind of thrill she had been craving. Malcolm led her through a hidden exit, stepping into a private elevator that ascended swiftly. The moment the doors opened, she was met with a cool night air and the sight of his red Ferrari gleaming under the streetlights. He opened the passenger door for her. Last chance to walk away, he said, his voice smooth but laced with challenge. Elizabeth smirked, sliding inside without hesitation. I told you, I'm in. Malcolm chuckled, shutting the door behind her before getting in. The engine roared to life, a perfect metaphor for the adrenaline coursing through her veins. As the Ferrari sped through the dark city streets, Malcolm remained quiet, his eyes focused on the road. Elizabeth studied him, the way his hands gripped the wheel, the way his jaw tensed in thought. He was calculating something, and she wanted to know what. Tell me the truth, she said. What was that meeting really about? Malcolm glanced at her before returning his attention forward. A business deal, he answered vaguely. Elizabeth rolled her eyes. You're not going to scare me away with cryptic answers, Malcolm. If I'm in, I deserve to know everything. Malcolm smirked at her boldness. You're braver than I gave you credit for. He exhaled, as if deciding whether to let her deeper into his world. That meeting was about logistics, moving assets, making sure everything runs smoothly. His words were measured, careful. What kind of assets? She pushed. Malcolm glanced at her again, his expression unreadable. The kind that change people's lives. Some for better, some for worse. Elizabeth narrowed her eyes. He wasn't just dealing in money. This was bigger. Are we talking politics? Underground networks? What exactly are you into? She demanded. He finally smiled, a slow, knowing grin. You ask too many questions. Elizabeth crossed her arms. And you give too few answers. Malcolm chuckled as he pulled the car onto a private road, the city lights fading behind them. You'll find out soon enough, he said, his voice holding a promise. They finally arrived at a secluded mansion overlooking the hills. The modern structure was sleek, intimidating in its elegance. Malcolm parked and stepped out, opening her door. Welcome to my home. Elizabeth hesitated for the first time. She had seen luxury, but something about this felt different. She followed him inside, taking in the vast expanse of glass walls, leather furnishings, and dim lighting that cast long shadows. Everything about this place screamed exclusivity. Malcolm poured himself a drink and offered her one. She accepted, swirling the liquid before taking a sip. "So what now?" she asked. Malcolm leaned against the bar, studying her. "Now, you prove you can handle this world." Elizabeth arched a brow. "And how exactly do I do that?" Malcolm smirked. "By making your first move." She set down her glass, meeting his gaze with equal intensity. "Then tell me where to start." Malcolm chuckled, clearly enjoying this. "All right," he said, setting his own glass aside. "There's a gala tomorrow night. High-profile investors, politicians, people who shape the world without ever being in the public eye. I need someone on the inside." Elizabeth leaned forward. "To do what?" Malcolm's expression darkened slightly. "To listen. To observe. To let me know which way the tides are turning." Elizabeth's pulse quickened. This wasn't just about being in his world, this was about playing an active role. "And if I do this?" she asked. Malcolm's smirk returned. "Then you'll be more than just a guest in my world." The challenge was irresistible. Elizabeth nodded. "I'm in." Malcolm clinked his glass against hers. "Then tomorrow, you'll officially be one of us." She knew the risks. She knew there was no going back. But something about Malcolm's world, the secrecy, the power, the thrill, it called to her in a way she couldn't ignore. She had spent her whole life surrounded by men who thought they ruled the world. Now, for the first time, she had the chance to be more than a socialite, more than a beautiful woman with a last name. She had the chance to be powerful. The next night, she arrived at the gala draped in an elegant yet understated black gown. She moved through the crowd like she had done countless times before, only this time, she wasn't just mingling. She was watching. Listening. Malcolm had given her a list of names, people who mattered, people whose conversations could shift fortunes. As she sipped her champagne, she caught snippets of conversations about global markets, secret negotiations, and deals that would never be reported in the news. This was the real world of power, and she was finally in the center of it. She spotted Malcolm across the room, watching her with amusement. He lifted his glass slightly in silent acknowledgement. Elizabeth felt a thrill rush through her. She wasn't just another woman at this party. She had a purpose now. She continued mingling, collecting information, decoding subtle alliances. As the night progressed, she found herself in a quiet corner with one of the most influential men in the room, a billionaire media mogul. "You're new," he observed, his gaze sharp. Elizabeth smiled coyly. "Just getting started." He chuckled. "Careful, darling. This world isn't kind to those who don't know how to play." She leaned in slightly. "Oh, I know how to play," she whispered. The man's smirk widened. "Then maybe you'll survive." The words sent a chill down her spine, but she masked it with a smile. She had spent years charming men like this, but tonight was different. Tonight, she wasn't just a socialite, she was an asset. And Malcolm was watching, waiting to see if she could truly handle his world. As the night went on, she gathered details Malcolm would find valuable, slipping through the crowd with the ease of someone born into privilege. But tonight, she was more than that. She was part of something bigger now. She knew it when Malcolm met her outside after the gala, his expression unreadable. "How did it go?" he asked as she slid into the Ferrari. Elizabeth smirked. "You'll see." She handed him a folded napkin, a seemingly innocent thing, except for the scribbled notes on the inside. Malcolm glanced at it before meeting her eyes, a slow grin spreading across his lips. "You're full of surprises." Elizabeth leaned back against the seat. "You have no idea." Malcolm laughed, shaking his head as he started the car. "Then let's see how far you can go." Malcolm drove through the city with an ease that mirrored his confidence. The Ferrari roared beneath them, slicing through the night like a predator on the hunt. Elizabeth sat beside him, her mind racing with everything she had seen and heard at the gala. She had stepped into this world blindly, but she was quickly learning its rules. Power wasn't just about wealth, it was about information, timing, and knowing which pieces to move. "You did well tonight," Malcolm finally said, his voice low. Elizabeth smirked. "Of course I did." Did you ever doubt me? He chuckled. Not for a second. As they pulled up to his mansion, Malcolm cut the engine, turning to face her. Tell me everything. Elizabeth leaned back, crossing her legs deliberately. Let's just say your billionaire friends aren't as tight-lipped as they think. She recounted the whispers she had picked up, hidden investments, shifting alliances, and a particular name that had come up more than once. Malcolm's jaw tightened at the mention. So he's making a move. Elizabeth arched a brow. Who is he? Malcolm exhaled. A problem. That was all he said, but the way his fingers drummed against the steering wheel told her everything. Inside, Malcolm poured himself a drink, his mind clearly calculating his next move. Elizabeth watched him, fascinated. There was a quiet intensity to him, something dangerous lurking beneath his polished exterior. What's your next move? She asked. He smirked. You're getting impatient. Elizabeth shrugged. I like being involved. Malcolm studied her for a moment. All right, he said, setting his glass down. You want to play? Then let's see how well you handle pressure. He handed her a burner phone. Tomorrow, you'll get a call. Answer it, listen, and do exactly as I say. Elizabeth's pulse quickened. No instructions now? Malcolm shook his head. You're smart. You'll figure it out. It was a test. Another layer of the game. Elizabeth took the phone, tucking it into her purse. I hope you know I'm not the type to fail. Malcolm smirked. Good. Because failure isn't an option. His words held weight, a silent warning that this world had no patience for mistakes. Elizabeth had spent her life perfecting the art of appearing untouchable. But this was different. This wasn't about appearances, this was about control. And for the first time, she wasn't just playing the game. She was becoming part of it. The next morning, Elizabeth woke up in her penthouse, the burner phone resting on her nightstand. She stared at it, waiting, anticipating. When it finally rang, she inhaled sharply before answering. Yes. A deep voice on the other end wasted no time. Walk outside. There's a car waiting for you. No names, no explanations. Just instructions. Elizabeth hesitated for only a second before slipping into a silk robe and stepping onto her balcony. Sure enough, a black luxury sedan idled in front of her building. This was it. The moment where she decided just how deep she was willing to go. She quickly dressed, slipping into a fitted black dress and heels. The moment she stepped outside, the driver, a sharply dressed man with an unreadable expression, opened the door for her. She slid in without a word, her pulse thrumming with excitement and unease. The car took off, weaving through the city with precision. Where are we going? She asked. The driver didn't answer. Elizabeth smirked. Silent treatment, huh? All right. She watched the city blur past, feeling the weight of the moment. She wasn't just playing Malcolm's game anymore. She was stepping into something much bigger. Something she couldn't control. 20 minutes later, the car pulled up to a discreet, heavily guarded building. Elizabeth stepped out, her heels clicking against the pavement. Before she could ask any questions, a tall, imposing man guided her inside. The room she entered was sleek, minimalist, yet radiated power. At the center sat a man she didn't recognize, older, refined, with sharp blue eyes that seemed to see right through her. Elizabeth, he said, his voice smooth but firm. I've heard a lot about you. She tilted her head, refusing to show intimidation. Funny, I can't say the same about you. The man chuckled. Not surprising. He gestured for her to sit, and she did, crossing her legs with practiced elegance. Do you know why you're here? He asked. Elizabeth met his gaze. Because Malcolm wants to see if I can handle myself. The man smirked. And can you? Elizabeth smiled. Try me. There was a brief silence before he slid a file toward her. She opened it, her eyes scanning the contents. Photos, names, transactions, things that most people would never have access to. What am I looking at? She asked. The man leaned forward. A problem Malcolm needs handled. The question is, can you handle it? Elizabeth's fingers grazed the edge of the paper. What kind of handling are we talking about? The man chuckled. Information is power, my dear. We need to know where their loyalties truly lie. Elizabeth smirked. And what makes you think I can get close enough? He studied her, eyes gleaming. Because people underestimate you. You're beautiful, privileged, and they assume that's all you are. Use that. Elizabeth's heart pounded, but she didn't show it. She had always played the role society expected. Now, she would use it as a weapon. Fine, she said, closing the file. Tell Malcolm I'm in. She was driven back to her penthouse, her mind buzzing with the weight of the task ahead. Malcolm was waiting inside when she arrived, lounging on her sofa like he owned the place. Well, he asked. Elizabeth tossed the file onto the coffee table. Looks like I'm officially in the deep end. Malcolm's smirk widened. And? Elizabeth crossed her arms. And I plan on swimming just fine. He chuckled, standing up. Good. He stepped closer, his presence intoxicating. Because there's no turning back now. Elizabeth met his gaze, fire burning in her eyes. I never planned to. The next few days moved fast. Elizabeth did her research, slipping into her role seamlessly. She attended exclusive events, charmed her way into conversations, and collected information without ever seeming like she was looking for it. People spoke freely around her, assuming she was just another rich socialite. But every name, every detail, she fed back to Malcolm's network. And the deeper she went, the more she realized, this wasn't just a game. This was war. Alliances were shifting, power was being restructured, and Malcolm was at the center of it all. And now so was she. But something was changing between her and Malcolm. Their partnership had started as a challenge, a test of her ability to keep up. But now, there was an unspoken tension, an electric charge that neither of them acknowledged outright. He watched her more closely, his touches lingered just a second too long. And when their eyes met, there was something unspoken, something dangerous. Elizabeth knew this wasn't just about business anymore. They were playing with fire. And in a world like theirs, emotions were a liability. But as the stakes grew higher, she wondered, was she willing to risk everything for power? Elizabeth had always been careful with emotions, treating them as accessories rather than necessities. But with Malcolm, something was different. The way he studied her, the way he tested her, it wasn't just about business anymore. There was an intensity between them, a pull she couldn't ignore. Late nights turned into whispered conversations, subtle touches, and stolen glances that lingered a little too long. She told herself it was just the thrill of the game, that Malcolm was another challenge to conquer. But deep down, she knew the truth. She was falling into something dangerous. And in this world, danger was fatal. One night, Malcolm invited her to a private meeting, a gathering of men whose influence extended beyond wealth. These were the decision-makers, the ones who didn't need headlines to control the world. Elizabeth arrived at an elite penthouse, dressed in a sleek emerald gown that made heads turn. The moment she stepped inside, conversations quieted. They all knew who she was now, Malcolm's newest weapon, the woman who had proven herself in ways no one expected. Malcolm approached her, a glass of champagne in hand. You ready? He asked. Elizabeth took the glass, smirking. I was born ready. The meeting was intense, filled with coded language and unspoken power struggles. Elizabeth sat beside Malcolm, observing, listening. She noticed how certain names carried weight, how small expressions revealed alliances. This wasn't just business, it was war. As the night progressed, a man named Donovan caught her attention. He was older, ruthless, with eyes that never stopped calculating. He watched her carefully, as if trying to decipher what Malcolm saw in her. You've made quite an impression, Donovan finally said, his voice smooth. Elizabeth met his gaze, unflinching. I make an impression everywhere I go. Donovan chuckled. I can see that. After the meeting, Malcolm and Elizabeth drove through the city in silence. The tension between them was different tonight. The lines were blurring, and they both knew it. You held your own in there, Malcolm finally said, keeping his eyes on the road. Elizabeth smirked. Was there ever any doubt? He chuckled, shaking his head. Not anymore. They pulled up to his mansion, but neither of them moved. The weight of the moment hung between them, heavy and undeniable. Finally, Malcolm reached over, his fingers grazing her hand. It was subtle, but it sent a shiver down Elizabeth's spine. You know what happens if we cross this line, Malcolm said, his voice low. Elizabeth turned to him, their faces inches apart. I don't follow rules, Malcolm. I make them. He exhaled sharply, as if battling something within himself. Then, without another word, he closed the distance between them. The kiss was slow, deliberate, a collision of power and passion. It wasn't just desire, it was a silent war between two people who refused to surrender. When they finally pulled away, Malcolm studied her, his expression unreadable. This changes things, he murmured. Elizabeth smirked. Everything was already changing. The next morning, Elizabeth woke up in Malcolm's bed, wrapped in silk sheets and the lingering scent of him. For the first time in a long time, she felt completely in control, and completely vulnerable. As she sat up, Malcolm walked in, shirtless, holding 2 cups of coffee. Morning, he said, handing her one. Elizabeth took it, watching him carefully. What now? Malcolm sat beside her, his expression serious. Now, we stop pretending this is just a game. Elizabeth took a slow sip, considering his words. And if I don't want to stop pretending? Malcolm smirked. Then we play to win. But winning in their world came at a price. That afternoon, Elizabeth received a message on the burner phone. Meet me. Urgent. Come alone. There was no name, but she recognized the location, a secluded rooftop bar with a view of the entire city. When she arrived, Donovan was waiting. He stood near the edge, swirling a glass of whiskey. You came, he said without turning around. Elizabeth crossed her arms. You made it sound interesting. Donovan chuckled, finally facing her. You're sharp, I'll give you that. He studied her for a long moment. But tell me, Elizabeth, how well do you know Malcolm? The question made her pulse quicken, but she didn't let it show. Well enough, she said coolly. Donovan smirked. See, that's where I disagree. He pulled out his phone, tapping the screen before handing it to her. Elizabeth's eyes narrowed as she read the message displayed. It was from Malcolm, to someone she didn't recognize. She's in deeper than she realizes. Keep her close, but don't let her get ahead of us. Elizabeth's grip tightened on the phone, but her expression remained unreadable. She handed it back. Nice try, she said, forcing a smirk. Donovan arched a brow. Is it? Elizabeth walked away without another word, but inside, she was unraveling. The words replayed in her mind, taunting her. Keep her close, but don't let her get ahead. Was this a test? A manipulation? Had Malcolm been playing her this entire time? By the time she reached her penthouse, she felt like the ground beneath her was shifting. She poured herself a drink, trying to steady her nerves. Then, as if summoned by her thoughts, the burner phone rang. She hesitated before answering. We need to talk, Malcolm's voice came through, calm but firm. Elizabeth exhaled. Yes, we do. When Malcolm arrived, he looked as composed as ever. But Elizabeth wasn't fooled. She held up the burner phone. Who was the message for? Malcolm's jaw tightened slightly. You spoke to Donovan. Elizabeth nodded. And he gave me just enough to make me question everything. Malcolm sighed, running a hand through his hair. It's not what you think. Elizabeth arched a brow. Then tell me what it is. He hesitated for a fraction of a second, just long enough for doubt to creep in. I needed to be sure of you, he admitted. I needed to know where your loyalty truly was. Elizabeth let out a sharp laugh. My loyalty? You've had me walking through fire for you, and you still weren't sure. Malcolm stepped closer, his gaze intense. This world doesn't allow mistakes, Elizabeth. I had to be certain. She shook her head. And are you now? Malcolm's silence was deafening. That was all the answer she needed. Elizabeth set her glass down with deliberate calm. I don't know whether to be furious or impressed. Malcolm exhaled. Be both. But don't walk away. She studied him, her mind racing. Trust was broken, but the game wasn't over. Not yet. The next night, Elizabeth attended another gathering, but this time, she wasn't just observing, she was hunting. She moved through the crowd, smiling, laughing, gathering information. But now, she wasn't just feeding Malcolm's power. She was collecting her own. If Malcolm wanted her in this world, he would have to learn something important. She wasn't just his partner. She was his equal. And if he ever tried to play her again, he would regret it. As she raised her champagne glass, her reflection in the crystal shimmered back at her. She wasn't the same woman who had admired the Ferrari. She was something else entirely. Elizabeth stood at the edge of the rooftop, the city stretching beneath her like a living organism. Every light, every distant honk, every shadow cast against the skyline represented a choice. She had come into this world wide-eyed, admiring a car that symbolized everything she thought she wanted: wealth, power, exclusivity. But now, she realized it had never been about the Ferrari. It had been about control. About proving that she belonged in a world that had only ever seen her as an accessory. She had played the game. She had won. But the real question remained: at what cost? Malcolm appeared beside her, his presence as commanding as ever. "What now?" he asked, his voice calm, unreadable. Elizabeth smirked, but there was no humor in it. "I don't know. You tell me. You're the one who never trusted me." Malcolm sighed, slipping his hands into his pockets. It wasn't about trust. It was about survival. Elizabeth turned to him, searching his face. "And what about us? Were we just survival too?" His silence was deafening. For the first time, Elizabeth saw something rare in him: uncertainty. Vulnerability. And it scared her, because she wasn't sure what it meant. She exhaled, looking back at the city. "I don't want to live my life waiting for the next betrayal," she admitted. "I don't want to constantly question whether I'm being used." Malcolm stepped closer, his voice softer now. "And I don't want to live my life without you." That admission sent a shiver through her. He had never said anything like that before. Always calculated, always careful. But now there was no strategy, no manipulation, just honesty. Elizabeth's heart pounded, torn between everything she had built and everything she had lost in the process. "Then prove it," she whispered. Malcolm nodded, as if making a decision in real time. "Come with me." Elizabeth hesitated, but then followed. They drove in silence, the hum of the Ferrari filling the space between them. She wasn't sure where he was taking her, but when they finally pulled up to a quiet residential neighborhood, her breath caught. It wasn't another penthouse or high-rise, it was a home. A beautiful, understated home with a small garden and warm lighting. "What is this?" she asked, stepping out. Malcolm leaned against the car, watching her. "The life I never thought I could have. Until you." Elizabeth turned to him, her chest tightening. "You don't get to just say things like that and expect me to believe you." Malcolm exhaled. "Then don't believe my words. Believe this." He pulled out a key and pressed it into her palm. "Walk inside." Elizabeth hesitated, her fingers curling around the key. Slowly, she stepped toward the door, her heart racing. When she pushed it open, she was met with something unexpected: photographs on the walls. Not just of Malcolm, but of them. Newspaper clippings of the deals they had made, the people they had outmaneuvered. A history of everything they had built. She turned back to Malcolm, emotions overwhelming her. "You kept all of this?" He nodded. "Because it matters." She shook her head, fighting back tears. "Malcolm, I don't need wealth. I don't need power. I just need something real." Malcolm stepped closer, his voice steady. "Then let's build something real." Elizabeth looked up at him, her walls crumbling. "No more games." He cupped her face gently. "No more games." She closed her eyes, exhaling shakily. For the first time in a long time, she felt safe. She leaned into him, and when their lips met, it wasn't just passion, it was a promise. Months passed, and Elizabeth slowly redefined what power meant to her. She and Malcolm didn't disappear from the world they had conquered, but they reshaped their place in it. Instead of chasing wealth for the sake of it, they used their influence to create something meaningful: businesses that supported underprivileged communities, mentorship programs for young women who had been underestimated the way she once was. Elizabeth found fulfillment not in proving herself to those who doubted her, but in proving that she could lift others up in the process. And Malcolm? He found a purpose beyond the endless pursuit of control. One evening, as they sat on the balcony of their home, watching the sun set over the city, Elizabeth took Malcolm's hand. "Do you ever regret any of it?" she asked softly. Malcolm was quiet for a moment before shaking his head. No. Because it brought me to you. Elizabeth smiled, squeezing his hand. I used to think that car was the most beautiful thing in the world. Malcolm chuckled. And now? Elizabeth turned to him, her gaze soft. Now, I know beauty isn't in things. It's in the people who change us. Malcolm exhaled, brushing a strand of hair from her face. You changed me, he admitted. Elizabeth smirked. You changed me too. They sat there in silence, the weight of their journey settling between them. They had walked through fire together, tested each other, broken and rebuilt trust. And yet, here they were, not as two people trying to outmaneuver one another, but as equals. As partners. As something neither of them had dared to hope for before, soulmates. The city continued to move around them, but for the first time, they weren't running with it. They were exactly where they needed to be. Together. And as the stars began to dot the night sky, Elizabeth leaned into Malcolm's warmth, knowing that the greatest power they had ever gained wasn't wealth or influence. It was love. Thanks for watching. Please hit the subscribe button for more notification.